Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan. My colleagues Len and Louis are both traveling today, so I'm solo, and I'm happy to be solo with a very special guest and great person, Daniel McAdams, who's the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute. Also co-hosts a YouTube show that's gaining in popularity called the Ron Paul Liberty Report. So I'm very happy to welcome Daniel to the show today. Daniel, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, it's great. And I was telling you before we started that Ron Paul has been a household name, around me for a long time, since the 1970s. My parents used to get newsletters from young Ron Paul. And so it's amazing, he's an amazing person, and he's been very consistent throughout his entire career about what his concerns have been. I think what I remember from those 70s, I was probably a high school student or whatever, and I might glance at what he was writing. It was a lot about the debt at that time, maybe not so much about militarism because we hadn't gotten to this crazy point that we are now with $1.5 trillion unfunded military budget. So, it's maybe you can talk for a minute about the Ron Paul Institute and your role there, how you've built it up over the years, and what you see its influence being today versus when I knew it as a newsletter writer way back when.
Sure. Well, I mean, the antecedent to that question is that I went to work for Dr. Paul at the end of 2001, right after 9/11. And I thought that I was OG, but you've got me beat on that. I discovered him in the late 90s when I was living overseas. And this was the run up to the U.S. war on Yugoslavia. And I had spent a lot of time in Serbia and Yugoslavia and in the neighboring countries. I lived over there for the 90s, and I knew the war was going to be an absolute disaster. It's just completely unfair, completely horrible, completely uncalled for, and that's when the internet, kids, was in its infancy, believe it or not. And there were just a few websites, really. I mean, it was hard to find them, but I discovered antiwar.com and Lou Rockwell. And then that's how I discovered that there's this guy from Texas called Ron Paul, who happens to be Republican, because I was anti-war, but I didn't really come from the left. And so I thought, wow, this is great. This opens all kinds of doors, and everything he was writing about Yugoslavia and about the coming war was absolutely spot on, proven right, of course. And so I thought, what a terrific guy this is. And when we finished in our time overseas and moved back to DC, I wanted to stop in, just kind of say, thanks a lot. You did great work. I didn't get a chance to meet him back then. That you just don't walk in and say hi to a congressman. But I did meet his deputy chief of staff, and we had a great chat. And I told him all about what great stuff they were doing and how much they inspired us, people like me overseas. And then lo and behold, about a year later, I got a call, and he was leaving, and he wanted me to know if I was interested in a job. So I had just been fired, so I was, yeah, quite interested in a job. So sometimes things work out well, and I worked for Dr. Paul then from '01 until he retired from Congress at the beginning of 2013. And so in those last year, he and I had discussed, should say he, I, and Lou Rockwell had discussed continuing what we were doing in the legislative office, particularly with regard to civil liberties and foreign policy, and calling it the Ron Paul Institute. So we kicked it off in 2013, and we started very, very small, and we are now in our 12th year, actually almost our 12th anniversary coming up this coming month, and we've done. This will be our 10th annual DC conference coming up on Labor Day, and this will also be our ninth Texas conference coming up here in a couple weeks, and we can talk about that later if you like. So we've been doing a lot of stuff, and our mission is really to do what Ron Paul did: bring people together, regardless of their political ideologies, on some very specific things that we can all agree on, and that's what we do.
Well, I'd say your influence is, I'm interested in that, your influence and how it's grown, because if I remember back to my own experience again during the Yugoslavia war, I wasn't there. And at that time, I had no reason to disbelieve what I was seeing on what then was the nightly news or whatever. And I remember just thinking back on it, there were little, there were little stories like they were trying to build a bridge over a pontoon bridge over a river. Will they get it done in time? And when the U.S. finally intervened on the ground, and I think it was kind of a disaster. But anyway, the bombing and the all the talk about ethnic cleansing, and at the time you just thought that was hey, that's real because it's on TV, so it must be real, right? And so, gosh, I'm concerned about it. I think that might be a joke in some movie, like I'm concerned about what's happening in Yugoslavia. So, um, we can fast forward to today, the amount of skepticism over those similar kind of operations is huge. And I would say that, you, Dr. Paul, and, people who are in your camp, whether it's, Dave Smith or Scott Horton or others, are sort of lead the charge on that. But you've got thousands and thousands of people who are skeptical of this stuff now. And of course, it wasn't just you, it was facts and reality that happened along the way, right? And people go, wait a minute, that couldn't have been true what they were telling me. But how do you, when you look around now compared to when you started, how do you see your influence as an organization across the political spectrum?
Well, I mean, kind of rephrase it a little bit. I mean, looking at skepticism toward overseas military adventurism, at the time in '99, I had had the benefit of already having spent at least a half a decade in Budapest, Hungary, and I was working with an organization called the British Helsinki Human Rights Group. And one of the things that we were doing at the time, we started out monitoring elections in the OSCE countries, and we were privately funded. Unlike the other Helsinki groups, we were privately funded, so we were not working at the behest of foreign governments. And one of the things that we started recognizing was this pattern. I would call it Color Revolution 1.0. And it was the antecedents to what we saw later in the Rose and Orange revolutions in the early 2000s, and then ultimately the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014, which was like the introduction of extreme violence into the mix. But prior to that, and in between you have things like Libya and others, but prior to that in the 90s when we were monitoring elections in newly democratic Central Europe, former Soviet Central Europe, we saw a pattern of political leaders who would emerge. They were populist. Um, Most of them were stringently anti-communist during the communist era, and they tended to be nationalists. I'm thinking about people like Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia in the late 90s. Um, and one of the things that they did when they were elected into office is that they weren't rubber stamping all of the deals that the corrupt people around the American administration wanted them to do. For example, with the case of Mečiar in the late 90s, 97, the Clinton administration was pressuring them to sell a steel plant in Košice in eastern Slovakia, the VSZ, I think it was called, massive steel concern. And they wanted it to be sold to U.S. Steel, I'm sure cronies of Clinton's or what have you, for pennies on the dollar, and he refused to approve that sale. And that sort of signed his death warrant, politically speaking, and he became a strong man, a former boxer, and all of these things. Whereas in reality, he should have been one of our great allies. He was opposing communism throughout the period, and he paid the price for it. And I don't want to give you too long of an answer, but the same was true in places like Albania, where I spent most of my time because I was there during the Civil War of, I would say, 92 to 98. And I was there probably 20 times or more for that Civil War. And the same was true with Sali Berisha in Albania, who was elected the first free president of Albania in 1992. And although he had been a member of the party because he was a cardiac surgeon, and you had to be under Enver Hoxha's Albania, he was nevertheless a stringent anti-communist, vociferously anti-communist, and he was elected to office. And one of the things the Clinton administration at the time demanded that he do was allow some surveillance of Yugoslavia from Albanian territory, and he was determined not to get Albania involved in the civil war next door in Yugoslavia, wisely so. And that became his descent into the authoritarian, the anti-democratic, and this and that. So we saw how the pattern started working early on, where you demonize someone in the press, and then that sort of greases the wheels for the war machine, or in those cases, it was the overthrow of the election regime to happen. And I can name probably 4 or 5 other places that happened, which brings us to Yugoslavia and the demonization of Milosevic, who was definitely not a schoolboy, no question about it. He probably will not be up there among the saints necessarily, but nevertheless, the stuff they were saying about him was just blatantly not true. But the demonization greased the wheels for the eventual NATO intervention, NATO war against Yugoslavia. So that was probably the first time. Prior to that, you saw these sort of non-violent demonstrations overthrowing governments, and now for the first time you saw a violent intervention in '99, and then the defenestration in 2000 of Mechiar in a classic George Soros type of color revolution. So anyway, that's how the whole thing got started, and then it ramped up in the 2000s in other places. So
Well, let's pause there for a minute and talk about that, and then maybe we can move on to how it's developed since then. But so when you say there was a color revolution or a sort of proto-color revolution in some of these places, and you also mentioned that the Clinton administration wanted to sell a steel plant in, was it Hungary to
Slovakia, yeah.
Slovakia to U.S. Steel. So I always liken kind of the grift of our modern politicians to, if you had a television that you just paid $2,000 for, someone breaks in your house and steals it, they sell it on the street for $50. They don't care. They made $50, right? The fact that they destroyed $2,000 of value or whatever doesn't mean anything to them, right? It's meaningless. That's just a non-functional number. And I feel sometimes with politicians it's the same. Like, hey, I could give you $100,000 of maybe 250 of political contribution to your PAC, and you could destroy $1 billion worth of value. It wouldn't matter to you, right? It's like, as long as you get your 250,000, it's so cheap to buy these people, and yet, and the headline prices mean nothing to them. It's just what they're going to get out of it. But in a situation like that, I just want to track through the players and how you see that happening. So Clinton administration, you said maybe they have cronies. They probably took a campaign contribution from the steel company, which was probably relatively small in dollars. And in exchange for that, they're going to use their influence to influence a sale to U.S. interests. Yeah, okay, I could see that happening. And the way that they do that is it USAID? Is that the arm of all of these color revolutions?
Well,
USAID creates the
I mean, they
playbook. You
do the
said
governmental
Soros,
arm.
but I'd like to explore that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all sort of together, I think. But USAID would be the governmental arm. The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, would be the quasi-governmental arm because they are funded by U.S. taxpayers, but they're not subject to any governmental regulation. It's the perfect NGO. You give us money, but you can't tell us what to do, and you're forced to give us money. But I put Soros in that camp, and he's less relevant now in terms of this specific thing than he was at the time. But I've always felt that Soros was sort of a conduit for like CIA money, and one of the pieces of evidence. Of course, I don't have a smoking gun, but one of the pieces of evidence is if you go through history and you look at the kinds of color revolutions or the kinds of overthrows that Soros has supported, they have 100% been lockstep with U.S. governmental foreign policy wishes. So he's acted as an arm, as a de facto arm of the government in every circumstance anyway. So if I sort of lump him in, particularly in Eastern Europe, which is where his origins are, in Hungary, and where he had a lot of interest at the time, that's sort of part of the game. It's a multi-dimensional approach, I think.
So, and what's the benefit of having Soros? If I have USAID and I've got the NED, what do I need him for? Is it just a force multiplier, or is there something that he can do where I'm even less accountable to taxpayers? Well, why even involve him?
Yeah, well, I think for a number of reasons. I mean, I think sort of ideologically, he's always tracked with the U.S. foreign policy, with State Department people and AID people. That's why he was worked so well with Clinton, and Clinton's people were very close to him. But of course, he never went away. But I mean, it's perfect because you have an virtually unlimited supply of money that's not really traceable, and you have this wonderful global benefactor who is nothing but a wonderful person just out for an open society, throwing out money in places where he's influencing and manipulating political parties and the media sphere. I mean, if you go somewhere like, I mean, when I first arrived in Albania in '93, there was only the Communist Party newspaper, and I think there was one opposition newspaper. But the market was there was nothing there. A couple of years down the way, Soros started funding a paper called Kohayon, And what they started doing is agitating against Saudi Barisha and in favor of the civil war which happened, which, in a small country, I think 1,500 or so people were killed. They started agitating for that, and that was coincidentally official U.S. foreign policy to get rid of Saudi Barisha. So you have someone on the outside. I mean, that's the whole use of the whole NGO world anyway, is that they're doing the bidding of the federal government. They're force multiplier of the federal government and federal policy, and they can help get the job done. And they have this sort of security. They have sort of this blanket of being, oh, we are just do-gooders. We're just in favor of civil society. So you can't question them. Would you dislike civil society? And so that's how they were able to wield so much weight. You throw $20,000 around in Albania in 1993. You not only get yourself a paper, you get yourself a gold-plated paper, right?
Right.
So a little bit of money went a long way back then.
There was a great movie back then. I'm sure you saw it if you were close to Albania about a couple of I think a couple of Italians who get on the wrong boat and they end up in Albania right after the revolution. They become refugees, just like the other refugees. Have you ever heard of that?
I
Great
don't know that I've
movie.
seen that. I'll have to
I
look that
remember
up.
seeing it about the time, but anyway, it was a kind of a sleeper little movie made, I think, by someone with ties to Albania. But anyway, so you've got this force multiplier of the NGOs, and then is there also a grift opportunity there? Like if I'm the Clinton administration, can people go and work for the Soroses or for the other people and make, $1 million paycheck while they're waiting for their next thing? Is that part of it too, like a think tank? Um, is there
Yeah,
like a
but
revolving door through these NGOs where government people come in, or maybe my cousin or my daughter or whomever? We've seen how Chelsea Clinton has just made millions being on this board
yeah.
or that board. Is it that kind, or Hunter Biden? That is it that involved too? Is it?
I think at that level, that super high level, there certainly could be. But at the level of people, if if you're going to go run an NGO in Albania, you're not going to be making $1 million salary.
Yeah,
You're going to be at the parent company back home, and that of course was the case with a lot of these quasi NGOs, and some of them had missions that sounded great. Things like the Urban League or whatever it was called. The Urban, is that what they were called? They're like, oh, those are the guys that clean up cities, right? No, no, they're involved in elections overseas.
yeah,
There's so much money. I mean, so the National Endowment for Democracy, you have the International Republican Institute, you have the National Democratic Institute, you have one similar institute. The name of it is escaping me. That Center for International Private Enterprise, right? So that sounds really good in free market. And then you have the other one, I forget what it is, but it's for the unions. And so you sort of take in the left and the right, and everyone gets paid. The head of the National Democrats and the International Republicans, they get paid big time money. And you're talking people like John McCain was a chairman of the National Republican Institute. So you have liberal interventionists, conservative interventionists, trade union interventionists, and quasi free market interventionists, all vying for this money
right.
to affect change over there.
And it used to be so. Even in the case, let's take U.S. Steel. Like U.S. Steel back in the '90s or in the '50s, certainly, there was that old saying: "What was good for what's good for General Motors is good for the United States, and vice versa." But it was somewhat true, right? I mean, General Motors employed a lot of Americans at very high wages, and so that kind of supported the middle class and the industrial in the Midwest and elsewhere too. Even in New Jersey, there were car plants that employed a lot of people who are now on disability, right? It's people like
Yeah.
that. So back in those days, but right after you were talking about, U.S. Steel became attacked by our own government. They destroyed its competitive advantages and liquidated most of it, and so suddenly they weren't that interested in what was good for America. But what it was good for is what I'm alluding to, is these like grifters who get something out of it. And then the biggest grift that we didn't even talk about yet is, I guess you're extracting wealth from these poor people, but if you can get them to join NATO, then you lend that. It's almost like an SPV in the old mortgage days. You create this fake vehicle to hold all your fake mortgages, but here you're using these countries like an SVB, right? Like Albania. I don't know how much they bought from the United States, but a bigger country like Hungary or Poland, well, you lend them the money to pay to your own military-industrial complex so they can get all the kit they need to bolt into the NATO hardware set, and it's very, very lucrative for the military-industrial complex. So that's probably one of the reasons why you want to control these elections, right? So that you get the right outcomes. Everybody joins NATO, and that's a cash spigot, and it's all plugged in to what you're already doing, where you're already getting donations and so on, right? Is that kind of, do you see
No, I
that?
mean it's uncanny. I almost wonder if you're reading my mind right now because that's Patrick. That is exactly what happened with Hungary and NATO. When it was first announced that Hungary was joining the Partnership for Peace program, and I think there was like a semi-U.S. base opening up in southern Hungary. I was very involved in politics there. I was working with a lot of politicians, and I just knew people there very, very well. I was working with the anti-communists there. But the Communist Party at the time, the Reformed Communist Party, was in power at the time. But so when all of this was announced, I was watching as Lockheed Martin and Boeing came into Hungary like freight trains, and they were throwing money around like drunken sailors. I am not kidding you. This is before the referendum on NATO accession, but it was in that interim period where they were in Partnership for Peace, but not quite in NATO. And I'm sure there are other military companies involved, but I was looking up close because I went on a junket with, I think it was Lockheed Martin. It was one of the two. I went on a junket down there to the air base, and I was working as a journalist as well. And so I got the whole dog and pony show. But it was very clear, and I knew what the local economy was like. It was very clear they were throwing around tons and tons of money. And in fact, I mean, I was pretty naive at the time. Let's be honest. I mean, I was hoping to advise Lockheed because I knew the players, and I tried to tell them at the time, listen, guys, you're throwing money at the Reformed Communists. They're going to lose this election. I think it was '98. They're gonna lose the election. You wasted a lot of money buying off the old commies, and it's gonna blow up in your face. And they didn't want it. They didn't want to hear it. They certainly didn't want to pay for it, right? But I saw them throwing around this kind of money, and then you had the NATO referendum in Hungary, and I was an official election observer at that referendum, and there were serious problems in some of the voting stations, and I was actually on Hungarian television describing some of the things that happened to me there. It wasn't an honest vote. They didn't reach the minimum 50% turnout for the referendum to be considered legitimate, but they sort of papered that over because both sides, both the left and the right, at the time thought that this is our future, and they could be forgiven for thinking that, hey, we're out of the Warsaw Pact, baby. It's going to be, everything's coming up clover. We're going to join NATO. We're going to be part of the West again, in this and that. Now of course things changed later on, but say once that happened, it's exactly as you said, Patrick. The money that at the time in Hungary was enormous for them was nothing. It was a tiny little bit drop in the barrel for what they were going to get because Hungary had to kit up on all this stuff, all the goodies that we were selling, that our people were selling there.
And it's interesting because if I remember, they would give you, if you're hungry, they'd give you a loan, and the loan would buy the equipment, and then you'd pay it back over time. Hopefully, your economy grows, whatever, but it's still coming out of your citizens' pockets. So, the real marks in that case are their citizens, I guess, and of course us. We're all the marks, but
Yeah.
so that's like definitely a major grift. But what it develops into is, at least in the 50s, maybe there was some nexus between, let's say, the Truman administration and U.S. Steel. I know they fought a lot, but as an example, or General Motors, whoever you want to pick, because at the end of the day, there was an American worker getting some benefit of it. Now, I guess the military-industrial complex argues that, hey, a lot of this stuff, it's the last thing we make around here. So weapons, actually employs Americans on some level. That may be so, but my point is, they're only interested in bilking the Hungarians or the Albanians or whomever, so that it goes into this ecosystem of campaign contributions and into politicians' pockets. It's nothing really to do with American voters, and the American voters are indifferent about it at best, right? Like, well, okay, Hungarian joined NATO, great, okay, but that doesn't really change my life if I'm in Toledo
Yeah.
doing my thing. It doesn't. It's hard to draw the line that it hurts my life, although it does. But so people don't care, but that's where the politicians are drifting away from representing any human being, and they're just representing themselves. Whereas you fast forward today, they make a couple $100,000 a year and they retire multimillionaires, right? And it's like
Yeah.
nobody really can draw the line of how that happened, but you see it happening over and over again. If you're very senior, you're a centimillionaire like Tony Blair or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, et cetera. So anyway, that was the process that you saw up close with these militarizing, well, with the grift, the tentacles of grift coming in, influencing elections, and that's what the influence is for. It's not necessarily to protect against some Soviet threat or Russian threat. It's to just get your tentacles into those economies and suck the lifeblood out of them. Is that a fair statement, or am I over?
I think that's a lot to do with that. I mean, think about the end of the Soviet Union. There really was no threat to Hungary.
Right.
Who's going to invade them? Slovenia? I mean, nobody would even notice. Oh my God, they invaded. We didn't notice. There was no threat. So why on earth would they have to spend, untold millions of dollars to upgrade their military? I mean, to a degree, yes, fine, but they were being sold a threat. And I would just say, for the sort of where the money goes, you missed only one stop, which is the think tanks and the NGOs, because they're important. You have the military industrial complex, you do have the politicians, but you also have to do the think tanks and the NGOs, because they're the ones who will put out papers about threats. And all the Beltway think tanks, the China threat,
Right.
the whatever threat.
Oh yeah,
They'll
there's got to
put
be a
out.
threat, and that's all funded by the same people who are funding these loans to Hungary or wherever. But so, yeah, there's no threat at all, and they've got to manufacture one because again, you can draw a line between someone stealing your TV set and doing
Yeah.
this. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just a way to steal, just to get $50, right? So that's kind of where this all goes. But then they've got to develop a threat. So, because I want to pivot to the news media eventually. But yes, you've got the think tanks, and the think tanks also are a perch for many retired generals and even retired media people and retired government officials. And so that's partially your payday at the end of your stint of making a relative pittance in the U.S. government. You end up there at making much more. So there's think tanks in that. So you saw all this developing through the 2000s, the 2010s. We didn't even talk about Iraq, which was, of course, another order of magnitude on all of this stuff. But in Europe, you could see it developing to where we've gotten now, where it's a totally people completely disconnected from their voters, disconnected from reality, like almost high on narratives,
Yeah.
and when reality doesn't line up anymore, they just get angry or they find a new narrative or something. But so maybe we should talk about the media from how do you see the media playing into this? Because often people say oh, they are all saying the same thing. Why is it that all the media is so compliant, and where is it coming from?
Well, I also do think that though there is a generational aspect, because the younger generation is not getting their news from cable news or from broadcast news, as the boomer generation is, and so they are, on the one hand, they're less susceptible, but I also think that there is an illusion that the quote unquote independent media is completely independent, because I think a lot of the same interests that were involved in broadcast media, they didn't just say, "Oh gosh, well, I guess we're losing our share." A lot of them became independent media, and if you look at effective, independent sources of information that happen to buck up against the prevailing narrative, um, then for example, TikTok had a lot of young people. The young generation has a much different view of our relationship with Israel, for example, than the boomer generation. And so they were making TikToks in the middle of what was happening in Gaza, and they have a sense of justice, and they didn't like what was happening, and it was very threatening to not only Israel but especially to Israel's backers in the U.S. And so that's when you had this phony narrative of the Chinese own TikTok, and they're going to steal our precious bodily fluids, so we have to sell it to a pro-Israel guy and get rid of all of the content critical of Israel. So that's what you have as well. So that's sort of another countervailing theme to the sort of freedom and independence of the quote unquote new media, independent media.
Well, even within the new media, we find that there's a famous story that I think Quincy Institute broke about paying $8,000 to per post, I believe, right?
It was
For
only seven now, only
only
seven.
7,000. Sorry, $7,000
These are
for
hard times. Come
yeah.
on.
um, so a lot of the people that you might think are just out there saying what's on their mind are not actually saying what's on their mind. And then, of course, you're right in this space. If this is what you have at stake, nobody's just that you're working on a way to develop yourself into at least a tens of $1 million fortune and maybe $100 million fortune as a someone in the Washington Beltway. That's what you're playing for. And
Yeah.
if the media that you used to control, but I still want to explore how that old media got controlled in the first place. Maybe it always was, but in the new media, where you're not just going to say, well, golly gosh, I guess it's over for us. You're going to, do some things to make sure that new media also reflects your point of view and your opinion,
Oh,
one
you
way
bring
or
someone
another.
like, yeah, I mean, you bring someone like Bari Weiss in to run CBS. She
Yes.
was independent media, but she has the right perspective. And it's not just on Israel. I mean, we've been focusing on that for a few years for a lot of reasons because it's been in the headlines. But you could say the same with the Ukraine narrative and other prevailing narratives, that have to be promoted. And so that's how you do it. But I mean, you also have the whole, the creation of bots by intelligence agencies and other special interests where you have thousands of bots, and anyone that questions that, like the day that Joe Kent resigned, go on there and say something positive about him, or even now go say something positive about him, and it'll be attacked with the same narrative by 1,000 people, almost the same words. So you can also do that too. I mean, so X, for example, is fantastic in many ways, but I've noted that it seems to be getting more and more dominated by an algorithm that is restricting information rather than promoting the exchange of information. And I don't pretend to be a technical expert, so I don't know how it happens. I just know how things feel, and it certainly feels that way.
Well, it also feels that even X, and I appreciate the new X is better than the old Twitter was in terms of censorship in many ways. However, let's get back to USAID. So it was pretty clear with USAID, NED, that they were doing these kinds of influence campaigns to influence politics and elections, even in Europe and elsewhere. It feels like at some point they got turned on the U.S. So, and that they're using the same techniques, the same kind of color revolution playbook to sow discord in the U.S. I mean, that's just my opinion. It feels that way, and so X will feed you discord. We know no matter what you're interested in, it will feed you a lot of negativity and discord because I think that's one of the things that USAI did overseas, right? Is that we're not going to pull together as Hungarians. We're going to fight each other, and out of that weakness comes the ability to drive your own people into power and such. So let's talk about the media and how do you see that? I know you said you were just preparing a speech for the one of your conferences about media influences and narratives. What are your conclusions there? Where is this all coming from and why?
Well, the one thing I would say, just in reference to what you just said, is one of the things that we were saying in the late 90s at the British Helsinki group as we were watching these things happen was exactly what you said. We said, you know what, someday these techniques are going to be coming to our shore and they're going to start using them on our shore. And it wasn't 20 years later it was 10 years later that started to happen. So definitely these were techniques and approaches that were being developed at the time and they were imported back home for use. So I think that's a very important thing to think about. In terms of media, I mean, what I'm going to talk about, and I don't have it written down. I mean, I won't write it down, but I mean, what I want to talk about is how this current U.S.-Israeli war on Iran is being covered, and compared to previous wars. I mean, the last time I was, for example, in 14, when the whole Donbass thing broke open, and when Russia entered the war on behalf of the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, you could follow it so closely on places like then Twitter, at the time. You could follow things so closely that you actually were a few steps ahead of the media, and it was incredible. And that has changed a lot. I mean, and, just using X as an example, it's difficult to access information. There is so much misinformation, there it is. I mean, it is extremely difficult. Now you can go to Telegram, and it's slightly better because you can customize your the channels that you follow to a degree. But even that is being heavily censored. And I mean, I remember the coverage of, for example, the Gulf Wars, the 1991 Gulf War, and maybe they were just pulling our leg, and I'm sure they were to a degree, but we were getting an enormous amount of information from the government. We were getting damage reports, all sorts of things, KIA, MIA, all sorts of things that we do not get at all now in this particular war, and I think, and you have Israel's killed what in the 200s of journalists. They've killed more journalists since the October 7th event than have been killed throughout the entire history. So you have this idea, in the second Gulf War, the second Iraq War. Remember, journalists were embedded with the military, and at the time, a lot of people, myself included, were up in arms because we felt like there would be pressure on them to toe the party line, and for a lot of reasons. Maybe they felt emotionally attached to the units they were with, which I think is natural, um, but also, but that actually, in retrospect, was much better than what we're getting today, which is no information at all. We're getting Carolyn Levitt telling us that we're full of crap and shut up and stop questioning things, right? I mean, that's about the extent of it right now.
Well, there's a lot of noise. I think that's one of the things that they figured out. And again, they may have figured it out over in places like Russia. I think that I remember reading an article about that's how, the new Russia handled information, is put out a lot of, fake stories so that people just go, I don't, maybe, could be. So, when you're looking at missile attacks on Israel, well, you can suppress the ones that are real, but some will still get through. But what that you can then do is put out, hundreds or thousands of AI generated ones, or ones from some other explosion an explosion that happened in Lebanon 2 years ago, and say, look at this. And so, and then have it be debunked. And then people just go, I can't make sense of it. It might be true, maybe not. Same with Epstein files, right? There were a lot of
Yeah,
things in
yeah,
there
yeah.
that were just fake images. They were not in the Epstein files, but people would say they were. And then other things that were truly there. And so, unless you want to be a full-time researcher on this subject, you just go, well, something happened there. I'm not sure which exact thing happened, but something must. And you kind of throw up your hands. That's what they want, right? So if they can't control the narrative the way because that stuff in in Iraq was probably fake, right? When they said, there's this many wounded, this many killed, this many bombs dropped. Those numbers may have been real and may have not been, but they were at least presented as true. I think if they were doing that war today, they'd just throw out a lot of slop, and
Yeah.
whatever really, the true things would just be buried in the slop, and so people would not. But again, when you see them doing this, is it just that the government has an idea of what they want to do? In this case, invade or destroy Iran, and so in order to not get opposition to it, they both use censorship and slop to keep us all off balance, so that we can't really respond.
Yeah, I mean, if I was an intelligence agency running a psyop, I would do that exactly that. I would put out I would put out stuff that looks almost right but can be debunked. Because if you share a couple of those with your friends or your followers, you become demoralized and you're like, oh God, I am so embarrassed. I got burned, and it's happened to me a couple times. And actually, it's true that I will hesitate to repost things because I think, no, I'm not going to get burned. I'm not going to get embarrassed. And I think that happens a lot. And you're absolutely right with the Epstein stuff. You saw all sorts of extremely salacious stuff, and people glommed onto that. And that's one of the things that, I was saying, at least at the time, that it first started coming out, is that people already tend toward the more salacious aspects, and of course they were grotesque. Even the legitimate things, quote unquote, that we were told were grotesque. But the focus, I think, if I was running an intelligence op, I would say the grosser the better. Put it out there. Let people, focus on that, and not ask questions like, cui bono. I mean, who is benefiting from this and why? Was it the Mossad or the CIA, or was it many intelligence agencies? Was it governments, or was it an entire culture of people with enormous amount of power who all seem to know each other? You know, so get them to focus away from the serious questions, and not that the pornographic aspect is not serious; it's repulsive, but we sort of tend toward that. We tend toward we want to see a car crash. We don't want to know why the car crashed, and I think that's if I'm running an op, that's what I'd be doing.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me too. Is that we're just seeing a lot of slop. But I don't. I've got to say that I don't really watch mainstream news anymore. I don't even believe it when I see it. I can just see right through it. I mean, I read the New York Times the way that I'm sure Russians used to read Pravda, right? That it's like, if they say there was a fire in the tractor plant, well, there's probably a tractor plant. There might have been a fire. There might not have been a fire. It might be that their production is down, so they're saying it's a fire. You don't know, but there's something that they're getting at by
Yeah.
posting this story here, and you can kind of read the tea leaves to see what it is. But what's certainly not true is the letter of those words of being actually correct. And so that's the way I look at most mainstream news now, is that it's put out for a reason, and you can discern what the reason might be. But there's no point in
Yeah.
even thinking like, oh, are these people onto something? Because they're not. They're probably not, unless once in a while they're going to do it just to keep you off balance, to say like, well, they said something that's true once. But how do you see the information environment in this war? Because on the one hand, the media hates Trump, and so if Trump was for the sun rising in the morning, they'd be for darkness, for the rest of our days. So there's that going on. But then this war is happening. How is it being presented to ordinary Americans? I mean, does it depend on Fox versus not Fox, or what's going on out there that I can't bear to watch anymore?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm at a disadvantage as well because I don't watch mainstream media. I probably should, but I don't want my blood pressure to go up too high. Um, but uh, so so I don't necessarily watch it, but the as to the coverage, yes, they hate Trump, but I think they love war more, and so they're conflicted because war brings bigger dividends, as they say in 2525, uh, you know, so. So I think they're conflicted in that respect, and they certainly haven't gone all off from what I've seen. I watch clips on X. I don't watch programs, but they haven't gone all off on Trump, because like the Democrats, they love war too. They all love war. So there must be a confliction. But I definitely know that we're not getting the full reporting on things. Now we had that fellow from CNN who went into Iran, if you remember, when the war first started. And I thought, I mean, he's probably not a good guy, but I thought he demonstrated a lot of bravery, and also dedication to journalistic principles by saying, "Hey, I'm going on the ground. I'm going to see what's going on," and he debunked a couple of the early narratives because he went into the stores and they weren't empty. People weren't panicking on the streets at the time, and that was the time when they were hoping for the overthrow. And he sort of debunked all of that. Well, that's a hell of a thing to do.
And he was
Then
criticized for that, wasn't he?
Yeah, definitely. Why are you being a mouthpiece for Iran?
Mouthpiece for the enemy.
Yeah, for the
Going,
enemy.
well, I mean, it's hilarious that became a thing, which was, I believe that would be called malinformation, right? In
Yeah,
the old censorship regime, which is information that's true, but we just don't like it. So,
yeah,
so if the grocery store is full and we say it's empty, that's malinformation that the grocery store is really full.
yeah.
So, it must be some sort of Iranian agent who's putting that out there and not just agreeing with us that there's no food in the grocery stores because we say so.
Yeah.
So, but I did see that, and I heard that that person was criticized for being a sympathizer, an Iranian sympathizer, which is bizarre that at least in that segment of the world, because again, the segment that you live in and are cultivating is growing, in my opinion, exponentially. So there less and less people are in that old segment where it's like, hey, they tell me to hate this reporter who reported on true facts. Um, there's less of those people, but they're still around, right? They're still around, and there's still that narrative out there.
Well, look at people like Max Blumenthal. I mean, he breaks a hell of a lot of stories, and he puts his middle finger up at the mainstream, and he breaks a lot of good stuff. And there are a lot of people like that out there, I think, that do that. But I mean, my policy has always been I'll talk to anyone who wants to listen. within reason. I mean, I'm not going to talk to someone with a swastika behind him. I'm not going to go on their show, but I was in somewhat of a quandary. I was invited to go on Press TV, which is Iran's TV, and not that I was worried about going on Iran. I was worried about my government, not theirs. But I made a decision to go on because I wanted to convey the message that, in a way, we're sort of victims of our own government as well. I mean, they say that they're victims of theirs. Well, we're victims of ours. I mean, we voted for a peace president and we got war. As Tom Woods always said, we try to vote for Gandhi and we get John McCain
John
every time.
McCain.
And we're the victims too here. And we have the Epstein class of elites that rule over us, and there are a lot of Americans who don't want to go to war, and they elect presidents and they get kicked in the groin over and over again. And so I think it's people need to understand this, that there are two Americas as well. And I think in my expressed optimism in this program I was on, that the younger generation I think is somewhat unfettered by a lot of these old shibboleths. And I probably sound like an old guy, but I have a lot of less. Dr. Paul always says this too. I do have a lot of faith in the younger generation, who sort of, they were in their teens and 20s when the Ron Paul revolution started, and I think that probably influenced them to a degree.
Well, how do you think that plays out? I mean, so there's a younger generation who maybe, and I'm glad you went on that program. I mean, I think it's very sad to think that, what we're doing and the way we're doing it to the Iranian government is appalling, right? That we murder people under a white flag. That even the Mongols didn't do that, right? They honored white flags. We don't, and didn't even used to be that way 10 years, 15 years ago. But we don't bomb, we don't double tap children's schools. It's just repulsive, and so it's good to get that message out. But so you've got a younger generation who maybe sees through a lot of this. An older generation, the Fox News cohort, from what I understand, they think we're winning. They have no idea what's coming down the pike in terms of an energy crisis that dwarfs the energy crisis of 1974, 75. They can't see it yet, even though it's there. I mean, sometimes you feel like you're the woman in the Terminator, where everyone's just with their kids at the playground, and she's like, you don't realize what's coming. That's sometimes the way I feel. But you've got this younger generation, older generation living in la la land, and you've got this, maybe wounded corporate press that follows their masters, which is the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industry, and maybe some other industries, finance industry. How does it all end? Because, we talked about division. And one way that I see this happening is, well, there was a fairly unified Republican Party that was maybe at 51, 52%. That's been split, right? So there's certain people who are for what this Republican Party is doing, others have had enough. And so it's split. So let's say that's now 25-25. And then you've got the CIA Democrats on the other side, which is 49, 50%. Interesting, there are no anti-war protests. The ones who are protesting Trump, even last weekend, there's nobody protesting on that side of the aisle protesting the war. They let the War Powers Resolution Act die. So they're for it. So let's just say that in the future, you split the 52, and now you've got, a majority on the CIA Democrat side. How does that end well for for the rest of us? What's the path forward here, other than that? Hey, maybe young people will figure this out for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for the you can't vote your way out of this thing, at least not yet. But I agree with you. The protest last weekend was completely asinine. And what were they for? They weren't anti-war. There were no kings. Okay, we don't have a king. I mean, yeah, it was devoid of anything. I mean, but I mean, I think a lot of these movements have started out to be sincere, honest movements. That were co-opted. The Occupy Wall Street movement started out great. It was kind of a left-right coalition against things like the Fed, who were ripping off people and promoting wars, and they all seemed very earnest. And then it was co-opted and it became sort of another sort of leftist kind of event. The same was true on the right with the Tea Party. It started out by Ron Paul followers,
Right.
and they were pushing Ron Paul positions, not only on the Fed, not only on economics, not only on that side, but also on foreign policy and on war. And what happened is that the corrupt Beltway uh, nonprofits who will rip off your grandmother by telling them all these things. They sucked up all of the direct mail lists, and they just cut out the parts they didn't like, and it became yet another sort of right wing pro war movement, and that just happens over and over again.
Do you think the USAID or the government's behind that? I mean, it's the same playbook you were talking about, isn't it? The same
They should
playbook of
be.
Eastern
I mean,
Europe?
they should be and could be. Yeah, why not? Why not? And we know that the CIA is allowed to propagandize inside the U.S. All of the constraints are off. And you mentioned earlier on about the white flag killings. But if you remember, and I was young, of course, and I think I studied it probably more completely when I was in grad school in the '90s. But when the church committee hearings came out, and America was shocked that its government was trying to assassinate foreign leaders. We were giving Castro a cigar with a bomb in it or whatever, and it was truly shocking because we aren't those types of people. We don't do that kind of thing. That's what the commies do. That's what the evil people do. And now here we are blowing up entire governments. We're blowing up old Grandpa Khomeini sitting in his study with his grandson, blowing him up, blowing up tons of foreign leaders. It's
We'll level a whole apartment building because AI, it tells us that there's a guy in there that is a high value target. As if
exactly.
there's so much wrong with that. Like the idea that that in hierarchies people aren't replaced. I mean, Napoleon said the graveyards of Europe are full of indispensable generals. There are no indispensable generals. You blow one up and then someone gets promoted. So that's the way it worked. I had three uncles in the Civil War who were generals. You know how they got there? By being promoted when other generals got shot, mostly. So, that's how it works. It's like you don't just you're not going to create that kind of chaos, but it's also it's like very immoral, even by the
Yeah, it's a
standards of
moral
war.
decay. It's a moral decay. We're no longer the Americans. We're no longer the people who can say, "Well, but we don't do that."
No,
That's
no, we
that's
don't.
that's what we're fighting against. We're fighting against people who do that. That's why we're fighting. Why we fight? Well, we're fighting against that. No, we actually are doing that.
Right. Well, I think too that you talk about narratives, but these narratives are getting so tired, and I think, as you said, not just young people, but people are seeing through it. So if you say that these riots that happened in Iran where supposedly 30,000 people were killed, that's obviously false. Max Blumenthal exposed that. Those numbers that were pulled out of someone's head. They had no basis in reality, but they were shooting police. Well, what would you do in America when people shoot police? And we know what would happen. We know it does happen. So, but what is the narrative here that we're freeing is it freedom for Iran? What does freedom look like? What does freedom look like to an ordinary 20-year-old? I said this with last week with Mike Ferris. But what does freedom look like now for an American, where you have maybe $200,000 of unforgivable student debt?
No.
There's not really that many jobs that you can do. You have no chance of buying a house. I'm not sure. As I said to Mike, I'm not sure what percentage of young women under 20 are on OnlyFans as their main source of income, but it's something. And on top of that, you've got other debt, consumer debt. You can't afford anything. A car costs what a house used to cost, and so you're censored. You're not allowed to say certain things on campus about certain countries. So what? So is this what we want for Iran? Is this the freedom? Like, what are we
Yeah.
fighting for? So what freedom are we going to bestow on these people? I don't know what life is like in Iran, but is it actually worse in
Yeah.
material ways?
Yeah. I mean, I think people that have been there, like Max, have talked a lot about what it's like there. But who was this demon? I think it was a member of Congress or a senator who said of those 175 girls who were slaughtered in school, he said, "Well, better dead than wearing burqas."
I think that was the head of the ADL.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
No, I think it was a. I think it was a.
Was it Randy Fine? Could have been Randy Fine. This kind of
It would
thing.
be someone like. It was
Yeah.
someone even dumber than him, believe it or not. I think it was like who's that Senator Kennedy? I think it may have been
Oh,
him
could have
actually.
been. There's
Who's
yeah. There's a lot. There's in a contest for stupidity. Like There's so many people in contention, so it could be any of them. But yeah,
Yeah, he's a knucklehead. Yeah, I mean,
that's the
first of all,
value.
they don't wear burqas in Iran, you moron. It's the people who are our allies. The dude running Syria, the Al Qaeda guy. Those are the burqa wearers, you
Yes.
idiot.
And that
You
guy who
know?
is literally, physically himself chopped the heads off of other human beings
Yeah, yeah.
with
Fighting
those
America.
hands, was shaking the hands of the prime minister yesterday of England. I mean,
Yeah,
so those are our morals. So
yeah.
what, that I don't see how the narrative survives that. You can't do those things. As I said in the beginning, facts creep up on you. You can say that, you know, tractor production's up, but people know how many tractors are around, and eventually it all caves in on you like it did in the Soviet Union. But how long does it last where, people have these narratives that people go, that's demonstrably false, or
Yeah.
that doesn't comport with what I'm seeing in my ordinary life?
Well, I'm not a boomer, but I was boomering out with my son, a couple of years ago when he was finishing up his masters and going off into the work world. And thankfully he got a job, but he was complaining about how difficult it is. And I was just boomering out saying, well, yeah, but back then we made a lot less money. Yeah, things were cheaper, but we made a lot less money, and da 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 da. And he showed me some charts where you look at the percentage of, the ratio of what you made to what you're paying for things. And I got a real lesson on how screwed these young people are.
Yeah.
I mean, the average age to buy a house for a guy is 40. Are you insane? That's when you're going to start having a family?
Yeah. Well,
And you're going to what? You're going to meet a 40-year-old and she's already mostly done with her productive childbearing years? I
that's a
mean, who's going to teach?
depopulation agenda right there, right? So,
Totally.
um,
I'm
but
sure it's just an accident.
yeah, it could be. But, also there's nobody, there are policies, right? There's a policy for everything. So there's a policy to go to war and spend $1 trillion. There's a policy to not do that. There's a policy to whatever you want. As a democracy, you can choose policies, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But that's what democracy is for, to scrap the ones that don't and try and do better for people, however that's defined. But who's your guy now? If you want a house before you're 40, or if you want to like get out from under all this a huge debt load, who or your gal, who's going to be on your side? Like, who even is out there saying like, I want to try some policies to give you, I don't know, a healthcare system where you won't be bankrupted if you have a major illness, for instance. Who's saying
Yeah.
that? Nobody. They're saying like, well, I'm not as bad as Trump. He's bad. He's really bad, and I'm not that bad. So you should vote for me, and then I'll make tens of millions of dollars selling your TV for $50, basically.
Yeah.
So it's a tough time. I wish. I mean, you're doing so much good work at the Ron Paul Institute and sort of opening people's eyes to some of this, and I just wonder. I always ask people, what's the way forward? What's the light at the end of this tunnel? I've had people tell me just leave the country. So, not everybody can be optimistic. But, Ralph Nader said he thought if you organize 1,000 people per congressional district, you can swing that district with 1,000 engaged people. And so, like, the mission would be, whatever you want to change, find 1,000 like-minded souls, which isn't that hard in this day and age. And, there's your leg up. But do you see anything like what breaks all this narrative fever and this war fever and these immoral actions that we're taking? How does it break?
Yeah, well, I would say two things. With 1,000 people, you can make those changes, but with 150 phone calls, you have a good possibility of at least forcing your representative to consider your position. And I was on the receiving end of those calls for over a decade, and not that they necessarily swayed Dr. Paul on a bad vote, but I would definitely, if I was getting 50 calls on something, I would go into Dr. Paul's office and I would say, "Sir, we're getting a lot of calls on this, and here's what people are saying." And we would have to go to work to explain the position in a way that people understood it. And we were usually able to do that because we operated on a set of principles, and that helped us a lot. But as to what we can do, Dr. Paul's famous line when someone asked that, he says, "Well, do what you want to do," and I would just add to that, and also do what you can do, and accept the fact that you can't bite off the whole enchilada in one bite. And for us, what we do at the Ron Paul Institute, our primary the primary thing that we do is we bring people together, and we're not a libertarian organization. We are a beyond political organization, founded on a set of principles that Dr. Paul spelled out very clearly after the 2008 campaign that were espoused by the so-called minor parties. And it's war overseas, it's debt at home, it's the Federal Reserve, which facilitates war. And so we bring people together that share those principles. In our upcoming conference, we have Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be a speaker. And I was on the phone with her recently. She called me up and she said, hey, so what kind of people should I expect that are going to be at the conference? And I said, well, probably be some people with mohawks, some people in three-piece suits, some people in leather jackets, some people in shorts, and she said that sounds pretty good to me. So that's what we're about, and we bring people together. And when they are together, they listen to great speakers, but they also get to know each other because I don't know how you feel, Patrick, but I often feel like I'm alone. I'm the only one thinking these things. It's this is horrible. It's terrible. And when you see people get together at our events, it's just amazing to watch because I can't bring people back after breaks because they're so excited to meet and talk to each other. So that's the one thing that we can do, and that's what we've been trying to do for these past 12 years.
Well, I think that's fantastic. First of all, I just learned two things. One is, I've seen solicitations to call your congressman, and I'm so cynical now that I'll just say, well, they don't care. If I call there, what's the difference? They're just going to get my information and track me or something. But it's not going to make a difference. They're still going to do what they want to do. But it's interesting to know that even 150 phone calls can get a congressperson to swing. And I think part of that, I mean, Ron Paul was a ethical congressman, but if you're a grifter, you don't want a high turnout. You want low turnout, and you just want to get enough people over the line so you win. And so, hey, if there's 150 motivated people who have three friends, that suddenly that could end your grift if you're not careful, right? So there may be some cause for optimism there.
A little bit, a little
Yeah,
bit.
and then the second thing is just bringing people together. I mean, I so agree with that. I mean, especially during the COVID years when you didn't really have the ability to say anything about any or even ask questions. Knowing that there's other people out there, that's what unfettered speech is for. We don't, we're not doing it for clicks or money, or it's just to let people know that there are people like you out there trying to make the world a better place, and it's important to know that there are people like that. So anyway, that's probably a good place to end. So Daniel, where can people find you?
Sure. Well, we do the Ron Paul Liberty Report Monday through Friday, starting at noon, live noon Eastern time. We're live on YouTube, X, and Rumble, and that's easy to find.
And
The
who's
Ron
on?
Paul.
Is that a guest format? Who's on the like? How do you do it?
So
Is it
Monday through Thursday, Dr. Paul and I sort of do news and analysis, and I'll do a lot of news and he'll do a lot of commentary. And then on Friday, my colleague Chris Rossini is the co-host, and they primarily focused on financial and economic information for that show. So that's how we kind of mix it up.
interesting? That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, we have a good audience, and we were old school. I mean, we've been doing it for 11 years now. When we started, hardly anyone was doing a podcast, and we felt really special. And now we feel like everyone and their dog has a podcast.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
But that's just how it works. But
yeah.
we're at ronpaulinstitute.org is our website. We there are a lot of great sites that put up tons of articles every day. We try to find the one or two or maybe three that we think are most insightful and interesting, and we put those up. So you can go to ronpaulinstitute.org and find all of that. And we love to have people to come to our events because that's what it's all about. And we also run a Ron Paul Scholar Seminar for upper division undergrads and grad students, where it's an all-day boot camp on civil liberties and foreign policy, stuff your profs aren't probably or not teaching you. And so that's really sort of our flagship outreach educational program that we're doing.
Sounds amazing. So thanks. And I just do a pitch for one of our own projects, which is Free Speech News. We do the same thing with we find there's so much now about threats to free speech around the world, and when we find an article that's sort of indicative of that, we'll post it on freespeechnews.org, and it's
Oh,
a
great.
compilation of threats to free speech and sometimes some victories for free speech. But if you're interested in that issue, freespeechnews.org is a resource. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast. So thank you, Daniel, for coming on. Really appreciate the time and appreciate everything you're doing to make the world a better place.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you again for the invitation.